Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to Workplace Health Without Borders members and guests. And if this is your first time, I just want to put out a big welcome to you. And it's just so wonderful to see so many people from around the world call in. I don't think I've ever seen so many different countries represented in the chat box. So this is fabulous. Thank you. So my name's Kevin Hedges. I'm the board member of Workplace Health Without Borders. I'm also the representative for communications and advocacy. And we've sort of been growing quite rapidly. And please join if you haven't considered joining. You can actually join um, the international branch on the website. So I just want to quickly tell you that we have a planning committee. WHWB have a planning committee for training, and we kind of try and provide up-to-date training, and we try and keep an eye on the ball and look at training that everybody would like to have. And obviously here we are in pandemic, and you know the hot topic is respiratory protective equipment. So that's what our webinar is on. So basically, as I said, our webinar is on respiratory protection. With the Omicron variant virus causing skyrocket illness rates around the world, respiratory protection is more important than ever. So this webinar that you're on now will explore standards for respiratory protection, whether fit testing is necessary, and how to do it if you do not have access to equipment, and how to ensure that everyone has the best protection possible against infectious aerosols. We have 3 speakers, and I think we have a recording too from Dr. Jen McDonald. So we have Stephen Verpaley. He's talking about the ISO standard 16975 and European approaches. Simon Smith, Canadian standards and international relevance to bioaerosol protection. Stacey Richardson, how to get a good fit with your respirator. And then Dr. Jen McDonald, medical doctor, do-it-yourself fit testing. I'll just quickly give you a quick update on all our speakers' bios. So, you know, Stephen Verpaley from Belgium has a Master of Science. He's also a board member, by the way, of Workplace Health Without Borders. He brings a lot to this webinar. He has a Master of Science Environmental Chemistry and Industrial Hygiene. He did a lot of research work on sampling and analysis for dust and elemental compositions in workplace atmospheres, especially silica, working for 7 years as head of the environmental section at the University College of Ghent in the Laboratory for Occupational Hygiene, and 11 years as principal occupational hygienist for an external company for occupational prevention and protection. Currently is the Industrial Hygiene Manager at the Nickel Institute Global Association of Leading Primary Nickel Producers. He is also founder and president of the Belgian Centre for Occupational Hygiene, a non-profit organization focused on research and laboratory services to industry regarding occupational hygiene exposure assessment. So the organization, Belgian Centre for Occupational Hygiene, otherwise known as BICO, has a MOU with Workplace Health Without Borders and provides free of charge analysis for occupational hygiene projects. He has more than 20 years experience as an industrial hygienist and as an expert in different ISO and CEN work groups, mainly focused on workplace atmosphere. As board member for the Belgian Society for Occupational Hygiene, he is responsible for all training programs organized by different parties regarding occupational hygiene. The link to the government as extraordinary member of the Belgian High Council for Prevention and Protection at Work, a Belgian representative for the EUOH platform. He is also co-chair of the Occupational Hygiene Training Association and vice chair of the International Affairs Committee of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. So recently, in 2020, he actually won the Yant Award. he was a Yant Award recipient, and also the 2020 ASTM D22 Award of Appreciation for the work he did for organizing the conference on metals and metalloids. I cannot think of anybody else who's done, such a fabulous job in the current situation globally to try and link people together and present. And the charity work Stephen does is phenomenal. So I think I'll hand it over to you, Stephen, now, and then I'll read the bios of the other speakers just before their presentations. So thanks again, Stephen, over to you.
Well, thanks, Kevin. It seems that I have to shorten my bio at some point because it's a little bit too much information for many people. And well, it's not really trying to show off or whatever, but maybe sometimes I feel when someone reads it that I do a little bit too much. Well, thanks a lot for the introduction. And well, I tried to keep it short and give you an overview. As Kevin already mentioned, I'm quite active for many years in the standardization. So I will provide, let's say, an update on a new standard that is currently under development. It's the 16975 Part 4. And I'll also give you an update on some European approaches that are related to also standardization and the way forward on respiratory protective equipment. So, well, first of all, as being active in international standardization, I think it is important, and well, my slides will be shared with everyone, and I hope I made the links accessible. Well, it is for many people difficult sometimes to find standards. So I put in here some, let's say, links where to find, let's say, specifically in this case, international standards from ISO. And well, here you have, let's say, the links to the protective equipment. So every standard that is related to protective equipment, and specifically also for respiratory protection. So there are quite a lot of standards, to be honest. Well, then I go to the 16975 series. So there are, 4 parts of the standard in total. Well, probably quite a lot of the discussions that will go on in this webinar today will touch some of the parts of the other standards. And well, there are 3 technical specifications. So technical specification 1 and 2 that are already published. So, and this is about the respiratory protective device program that you can roll out in your company. And 2 is actually a condensed guidance to, let's say, establishing and implementing a respiratory protective device program in your company. So those are, specifically also important. And well, are also the reason that there is now a Part 4 developed, because we have seen that in the let's say stage where there is a pandemic or an epidemic or an outbreak, that it is important, to add some extra things, specifically on, let's say, respiratory protective devices, usage, programs, and fit testing. Well, out of those 4 parts, there is one real standard. And so there is a difference between a specification and a standard, as a standard is really normative. And this is about fit testing. So there is a standard on fit testing procedures also in this series standards. So if we go to the Part 4, so this is really about pandemic and epidemic and outbreak of infectious diseases. So it is really, scoped to assist the responsible person within the workplace to select, use, and maintain respiratory protective devices, well, called also as RPDs, and to guide those developing pandemic-related respiratory protective programs. And, as I mentioned earlier, it should be used in conjunction with the other parts, as, many of the things that are written in the other parts are applicable also when a pandemic is there. It focuses on particle filtering RPD only as a respiratory protection against pathogens, and it does not apply to RPD programs if the RPD are used exclusively for medical life support, for example, medical life support respirators and resuscitators. And it is also written to assist in the preparation of national or local regulation and guidance. And I will come back to that a bit later when we go to the European approach. So there are some new definitions. As everyone knows, or should know who have ever seen a standard on respiratory protection, there is a difference between a particle and a droplet. And it was clear that a droplet was mentioned a lot in the whole pandemic discussion for the last 3 years almost. And there was not really a clear definition. And it should be defined because many respiratory protective devices are actually tested with, pure aerosols or particulate matter. And this is not exactly the same as a droplet, to be honest. So here you see the new definition. So the droplet and very small drops of liquids, such as particle of moisture discharge from the mouth during coughing, sneezing, or speaking. And then you, of course, have the droplet transmission, where you actually have the spread through exposure to respiratory droplets exhaled by an infectious source. And so both are quite new and should be dealt with differently as when we talk about particulate exposures. There is also a respiratory interface. So, a part of the protective device that forms a protective barrier between the wearer's respiratory tract and the ambient atmosphere. And this is specifically, for droplets and any, liquid-based aerosols actually that are spread. And because there is a clear difference between a particle that is mainly dry, let's call it like that to make it easy, and some wet aerosol, and the way it behaves when it reaches your, let's say, breathing zone. There is also social distancing. I think everyone knows now what it means, a new definition. Also, the surgical respirator is a new definition. Because you will see in the wording also when we go to the European approach that there is a lot, let's say, called as respirator, as a respiratory protective device, and so on and so on. And I think it needs to be clear what a specific respiratory RPD means. Actually, there are so many different types that it is important to have some kind of definition. So this is all included in part 4. Well, what is also important is that there is, let's say, an indication to the role and the purpose of RPDs, surgical masks, and community face coverings. And I think that is specifically new because I think in workplace environments, community face coverings were not really used in the past. So now we see, let's say, the community face coverings also showing up in workplaces. So here you see the definitions and the role and purpose of surgical masks are also called medical mask. And it's clear that it is intended to be used in operating rooms and some healthcare settings. And it is designed to protect the patients and surgical working environment by preventing release of expelled, exhaled droplets from the wearer. And so that is a clear difference with, let's say, other types of RPDs. And then you also have the non-fluid resistant surgical masks. And while they are, they reduce both the wearer exposure to droplets and the transmission of the expelled and exhaled droplets, and are specifically not suitable for spray or projected fluid exposures. And while some of those masks are specifically designed to prevent against projected fluid exposure. Well, face coverings, and those are self-made or commercial face coverings made of cloth or other textiles or paper even. So, they're intended to reduce the transmission of droplets from the wearer to the environment, and also prevent, they can also prevent a certain level of contact between the hand and nose mouth to reducing the risk of infection due to hand hygiene failure. And so that is what is written now in the part. And we also, was a lot to do, and there are many more things in this part 4 standard, but I highlighted the most important one. There was also a lot to do about exhalation valves, and as they also are very important, and it is clear that it cannot be used if the RPD is used as a source control. I think that's very clear. But many filtering facepiece and elastomeric respirators have unfiltered exhalation valves, so there is a direct transmission to the environment. And well, what many people also don't know or don't realize is that most of the powered air purifying respirators, or the PAPRs, do not filter the exhaust air escaping from the head top. And so I do believe that I heard in many communications, well, PAPR, that's fine. There is nothing wrong with that, as it is, let's say, an overpressurized mask. But, most of them do not filter the exhaust air. So you need to be careful if you choose the right protective equipment, that you choose the right one and take this into account. What I also want to highlight are the annexes, because, what we call RPD and how they are classified is very different if we take, let's say, different jurisdiction into account. And so, for example, all annexes in this standard give an overview per region in the world on the applicable requirements for all sorts of RPDs. And for example, here I give the requirements for face coverings, where you see that the requirements are totally different in Chinese standards compared to the European standards, compared to the Australian standard, compared to the US standards, and so on and so on. And I think further on in the webinar, we will have some other approaches from other regions in the world. So also, the comparison of different types and the performance of particle filtering RPDs across the world are quite different. And this is based on standards as such, as there are specific standards written to give you an overview of the performance of the particle filtering. And you see here, Australia, New Zealand, ISO, Brazil, Canada, China, the European standards all give, let's say, different performance requirements. And so, I think, many people don't realize that, but that is somewhat the importance of standardization. And the same, if you don't have standardization, we don't know the A4 format for papers to write on, and so on and so on. So that is all about standards. So, but across the world, you can have different, let's say, performances a standard needs to apply for. So, for example, especially in particle filtering, there is a lot of difference depending on the standards all over the world that are applicable. And so a P1, for example, if you talk about FFP1, FFP2 has different requirements for performance in different jurisdictions. So take this into account, please. And also, I think what is important, and this is to relate to the, let's say, European approach, is that, it provides also information on the use of community face coverings, including the use by children. And because we talk about, although this is within a workplace air committee, I think we have to take into account that all those face coverings and so on in a pandemic are also used by children. And many of the performance requirements are not really meant to be applicable for children. So, and hereby I refer to, let's say, a freely available European standardization workshop agreement document. And I provided the links here that looks at the issue of community face coverings, including children over 3 years of age, and the minimum performance and design requirements for those community face coverings. And this automatically, takes me to the European approaches, as this, of course, freely available workshop agreement comes back many times in our approaches. And I think a very important one in this perspective is said that, well, although a bit late, I have to admit, but I don't know any jurisdictions in the world that wasn't late in the response to the pandemic. But also, the Europeans were a bit late. So you see here that it took until March 2020, and that actually all European countries decided that all standards, European standards available for medical supplies, including RPE standards, were made freely available within every single European member state. And this is a very important part, because in many cases, and I hear that quite a lot, the main issue that people don't use standards is because they are quite expensive. And I can only agree with that. But of course, there is a whole system behind that, and that also needs to be paid. So, I cannot do anything about it, but especially when there are extraordinary situations, I think it is clear that, and it was really good to see that, at least at European level, that all standards were made freely available. And I downloaded them all. There are more than 256 standards on medical supplies. And so going from gloves to protective clothing, to RPE, and so on and so on. So to make sure that everyone knows what the minimum requirements are, I think it was very important that they were made free. Then we had a European CDC technical report that provides recommendations about RPE wearing. And this was also released in, let's say, 2020. Where it was clear that in confined public places, medical or non-medical face masks were always recommended. Crowded outdoor settings, face masks shall be considered. So yeah, I do know, recommended, considered, it's not obliged. I do know that, but it's it was very difficult. And I think all jurisdictions have the same issues. Politically, it's really difficult to sometimes oblige something. So, but common sense makes sense. If people can all read or download standards, they will understand why it is important to wear them. Well, for people vulnerable to severe COVID-19, medical face masks should be used as personal protection. And also in households, medical masks were recommended for people with symptoms or confirmed COVID-19 cases, and for people who share their household, especially in isolation or with symptoms or confirmed COVID-19, if not possible. So, I think it was clear that there were quite recommended rules within Europe. And I think also for workplaces, other than healthcare and certain professions that involve physical proximity, I think this was specifically, well, I'm quite sure it was specifically for outdoor workplaces like the construction industry and so on, that face masks were always, obliged as complementary measure to the technical and organizational measures, in this case for COVID. And in healthcare, it was only respirators that were obliged. I think, non-medical face masks, this was in the guidance. Well, there were two levels of community face masks considered according to their filtration efficiency to particles around 3 microns. And so this in relation to the normal, let's say, respiratory protection in the standard. So there was a level of 90%, so that can filter out those particle sizes with an efficiency greater or equal to 90%, and the 70% level that greater or equal to 70%. And this leads actually to, some European members have taken, well, very specific actions regarding RPE, especially I think Germany and Austria. They made surgical masks or KN95 or FFP2 masks mandatory in stores, public transport, and where there is close or prolonged contact with other people. And therefore, they actually provided FFP2 masks freely to respectively 27 million and 1.2 million people who are over 60 years old and have certain pre-existing conditions. And so those FFP2 masks were actually spread out freely to all those people that were over 60 or had, existing conditions. And in France and most of the other member states, I say most, not all of them, in the category 1 masks, or that means FFP2 masks, surgical mask and fabric mask that meets the requirements of the guidance standard, are obliged everywhere. So no specific actions were taken to deliver them for free to high-risk groups and the other member states, but at least we had an obligation for those masks to be worn at all places, especially now, as Kevin already mentioned, now in the situation of the Omicron, we have some serious issue with the serious spread of the Omicron variant. So I think, this was my part. I hope I was within the time. Well, I think there will be a moment for questions at the end. So thanks a lot. And well, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephen. We really appreciate your time and fabulous information, international information for the international standard. And I just want to welcome Eva Dickinson too from ISRP, the international, sorry, Eva Dixon, I should say, Eva Dixon. She's the president for the International Society for Respiratory Protection. She's the president. So it's really important that we're all in the same situation here, and have all these different standards around the world, and we really need to think about what we're doing in a kind of a standardized, harmonized fashion. I think, Stephen, if you don't mind, we might leave the questions to the end, and that way we can have some general discussion. And so the way we've pitched this, we've got Stephen talking about the international standard, and then we've got Dr. Simon Smith talking about the Canadian standard. And then we've got Stacey Richardson talking about, so Stacey's talking about how to get a good fit with your respirator. And, just before I talk about Simon's and Stacey's presentation, I guess, as I'm listening through these webinars, fit is so important. The take-home message here is think about how important it is to get a good face fit as well. So, okay, so Dr. Simon Smith has recently retired after a career in respiratory protection research for over 38 years. Dr. Smith he's had an enormous amount of experience in research with respirators. So he started out his doctoral work on sorbent media, followed by employment with respirator manufacturers. First, Rakel Health at Safety as a research manager, and after its takeover by 3M. Continuation as a research scientist in Brockville, Ontario, Canada. He worked in filter development and evaluation methods for new products for military, industrial, healthcare, and emergency responder applications. Simon has been contributing to standards development for over 15 years and currently chairs the ISO working group, creating standards for respirators for emergency responders, and contributes to several Canadian Standard Association committees addressing respiratory protective equipment selection, use, and performance, and to the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine PPE Committee. Simon has formerly served as president of the International Society for Respiratory Protection and as chair of the American Industrial Hygiene Association on Respiratory Protection Committee. So in Canada, we have a national aerosol coalition. It's been coordinated by Alec Farquhar, who's on the webinar. And Simon is our lead in respiratory protective equipment. And, there's been quite a few interviews in Canada about, the importance of airborne precautions. And Simon's always the first person that we ask to speak at these interviews. But I'd just like to hand you over to Dr. Simon Smith. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you for the very generous introduction and for the invitation to speak today. So I shall be talking today about Canadian respiratory protection standards, which, although it is relating to national standards, it may be something that is of interest in other countries when you are developing your own standards and protocols, and covering both performance and selection and use. For the talk, just to say, I've put references at the end highlighted to save room on pages. And we're kind of talking very high level about standards, so please don't take anything from the talk as a reference. Do check the guidance, and Canadian standards are available for free viewing, and the links show where that is. So thank you very much again. In Canada, we have a situation, as many people are familiar, where the regulation of health and safety is broken up across provinces. So we have some national guidance, and that mainly relates to healthcare products. But otherwise, every province, and we have 13 provinces and territories in Canada, has its own regulations on health and safety. And so requirements do vary across the country. But we do have a national set of standards that cover equipment, performance, and selection and use. And the Canadian Standards Association is actually a body that creates these standards in this domain. There are other standards bodies in Canada covering other aspects of occupational health and safety. Clothing, for instance, is a separate organization, and other standards in Canada. With the standards covering respiratory protection, we have currently 5 active in Canada. Some are selection guidance, some are performance requirements, as indicated by the color there. I'll just be talking about 2 of those today, and I'm just actually touching very briefly on the performance one. That's a new standard that has been developed over the last year. Normally it takes about 3 or 4 years to develop a standard, and we've done it in about 10 months. So it's a new standard and part of a new certification system in Canada. Just to say, because historically, the bulk of the manufacturers providing products into Canada were from the USA, we had adopted generally the US standards, the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety, or NIOSH standards, and that's become used over the last 50 years. So both the users and the manufacturing community are very familiar with this standard. And if, as was needed, when we had to look at creating a new standard for performance in Canada, we move away from that, then it creates some concerns as to whether people are going to be adequately protected in a new standard, or whether manufacturers have additional burden. Because of heavy workload with NIOSH and prioritization of Canadian products, it was decided to create a new Canadian standard. So just speaking a couple of slides about that standard, but then we'll move on to selection and use. With this new performance standard, it's available for free viewing, and there's a link at the end. It followed on from an interim specification from Health Canada for some products for healthcare use that allowed Canadian companies, and we had a number of new companies starting up who needed to get products approved. First of all, Health Canada provided a means to do that, and then the CSA created a new standard to take over from that. The standard was developed so that it followed very largely the NIOSH requirements, but it did bring in some new classifications of products, and it brought in some extra requirements, because if people are familiar with NIOSH standards, one thing that is not available, particularly for filtering face pieces, is actually any fit testing requirement within the standard for demonstrating that the design fits to a population of face sizes. And so we've incorporated that as one of the tests as a requirement for new products for use in Canada. We've incorporated also the surgical respirator requirement, that splash and flammability protection that Stephen mentioned, as classifications within the standard. Other areas where there are some differences from NIOSH, and these are more in detail than in general, are in some cases, the NIOSH standard states things perhaps in a general statement. Airflow resistance of multiple filters on a respirator must be approximately equal. In the Canadian standard, we actually define a method to determine a degree of a difference that is acceptable, or that particularly with vision, that it must not impede vision. We have criteria in Canada already, in fact, that define the quality of vision protection that needs to be provided when there is an eyepiece. as I said, the standard is available for viewing, and it is perhaps more plain language. It does bring in some requirements or language from the ISO standard that Stephen mentioned also. We use the same term, respiratory interface, for instance, in the standard. And one thing we brought in was some airflow resistance classes, because in discussion with the committee that was developing the standard, it was clear that fatigue induced by respirators was a clear issue for the healthcare community. And so we gave the option, particularly for the N95 classification, for there to be different gradations of airflow resistance, so that if a manufacturer can produce a product that has a lower airflow resistance than mandated by the NIOSH maximum, that can be declared in the product designation. And so that gives the people who select respirators for use in healthcare the option of selecting those that have low airflow resistance and therefore impart lower fatigue to the wearer. This table just shows the matrix comparing NIOSH and the new CSA standards. We have to put CA in front of the classifications to distinguish them, because NIOSH is actually protecting their N95 and similar classifications now. But as you see, they're very close. We do incorporate the surgical types within the standard. And as mentioned, for the N95s, we have these gradations of airflow resistance capability. Otherwise, things are very much the same, again, because of strong familiarity over 50 years with these classes. So that's I'm afraid where I'm going to leave that. And as I say, you can look up this standard in full, and I'm happy if people have questions later on to answer those, and other people on this call are on the same committee, and we'll be able to assist with that as well. So there are these new classes. Beyond that, we have a much more well-established standard, actually since 1982, for selection, use, and care of respirators. That is used across the country. In some places, it's actually legally required. Others, it's considered the best practice. And that gives full guidance in setting up respiratory protection programs, in the requirements for training qualifications of those involved, risk assessment processes, medical clearance, and overall the management of programs with fit testing and appropriate use of respirators. This is very familiar to people in Canada, but in 2011, and following the SARS epidemic which actually had some consequence in Canada, there was a report created, and we took some of the outcome from that report and built them into the update to the standard. And that particularly led us to create guidance for selecting respirators for protection against biological aerosols. And we believe this was a world first when it was introduced. So we needed to find a way to do this. What we have, first of all, though, is to consider that any selection process has to be part of an overall program. And that means that all hazards have to be assessed. Even in hospitals, there may be other hazards besides biological ones. And we also extended the biological selection requirement to cover non-healthcare workplaces. So that some places where there may be hazards from adverse health effects, sensitization from biological materials, or other problems of allergies and so on that needed to be addressed were covered within the standard too. But overall, you need to assess all of the hazards in the workplace, oxygen deficiency, chemical as well as biological hazards, and then using fairly recognized protocols for the chemical hazards to determine the level of respiratory protection required. And there's a flowchart available that guides one through this. For biological hazards where there are no defined exposure limits, we came up with this control banding method. And that really applies where there is no other guidance. And it helps to support programs, and it also fills gaps in existing guidance. One can consider what are the sort of options for guidance that exist. And the most commonly used one that we're very familiar with is the so-called expert opinion method, where some agency and authority says that you need a certain level of respiratory protection to deal with certain circumstances in the workplace. And we've heard about this, early on, at least in the pandemic. It hopefully is being updated now, but some of the authorities were saying, well, medical masks can be used for general use in the hospital, but where you have aerosol generating procedures, and there is some consideration over what that actually comprises. But in those cases, then you upgrade to so-called N95 respirator or a filtering face piece respirator. What we've seen sometimes is that, particularly in Canada, where we have multiple agencies that I talked about, multiple authorities, we have the issue that they may disagree with each other, and also they may disagree with occupational hygiene principles, particularly the precautionary principle that would say that you assume there is a high degree of hazard before you prove otherwise, rather than keeping fingers crossed and hoping that what you are offering is going to work. So there are some issues with expert opinion. Another method is so-called quantitative modeling, where you try and put a number on all the factors that contribute to a person using respiratory protective equipment getting infected, and come up with what is broadly termed a probability of infection. And this has been tried in some standards, an early ANSI standard, but it is problematic that you need numeric data on all of the factors that contribute to infection. And with emerging pandemics, that of course isn't necessarily available. And also there's a question that what is the acceptable probability of infection? So if you're a union leader or a hospital manager, what would you say is acceptable for your staff? Well, that's a very hard question to answer. So that method really isn't in favor. But control banding is a method where you make an assessment in the broad range of level of a particular factor contributing to the overall selection criterion, and then use that as an input to an algorithm to come up with an appropriate output. This does need some skill in assessing what those levels are, and it may lead to a simplification, but it is a reasonably good approach, particularly when you're dealing with novel circumstances. And part of the mandate for developing a Canadian standard was in fact to deal with a future pandemic that we are now facing, of course. There's references on control banding that can explain it much more thoroughly, but basically it was developed for the pharmaceutical industry when new materials were being created, that obviously it was not possible to have full healthcare and toxicology information about. But if you knew approximately how the chemical features matched other compounds where you had toxicological data, it enabled health and safety criteria to be developed for them. So when you don't have all the information aids decision making, and the simple method is that where you may have a continuum of some level, like a toxicity, you divide this into bands so that even if you don't know the value exactly, you can say roughly where it is. Those bands then become input into an algorithm that combine with other factors that lead to the decision output that you want. Once relatively simple training is done, it's quite a simple and effective tool. We applied this method into this Canadian standard for selection and use. What we looked at there for the inputs were the nature of the hazard, generation rate, how much, obviously what activities were underway to create the airborne matter, and what controls were applied, particularly ventilation in the zone. We have, for the nature of the hazard, actually a scale that's been developed by World Health Organization and National Institutes of Health that already gives a 1 to 4 ranking. That is not an ideal system, in fact, but it is at the time one of the best, the only ones available. The generation rate, again, we came up with criteria that match the patient environment and the tasks underway. And for the controls, in the Canadian standard, we looked at two sets of criteria, one for healthcare and one for general buildings, given that healthcare facilities generally have better ventilation. Perhaps that's a risky statement, but that's what we took then. And again, selecting either one of those, and again, a 1 to 4 scale on what the quality of the ventilation applied was. So with this basis, we then look at the outputs. And what we want as an output is a broad level of respiratory protection, which aligns with the assigned protection factors of different designs of equipment. Again, we recognize, say with ISO, that this is not going to match equipment types, it matches the testing of the product, but this is, again, applicable to the general understanding and rationale applied in health and safety in North America. Also need to point out that in this system, a surgical mask, because it does not fit closely to the face, is not recognized as respiratory protection. It may be PPE, it may provide splash protection, personal protection, but it is not providing anything like adequate respiratory protection. So it is a 0 on this scale. Other than that, the filtering face piece and half faces are level 1, loose fitting powered air 2, full face piece negative pressure respirator is a 3, and tight fitting PAPA is 4. We also have on the CSA scale a 5, which doesn't come into the biological selection. That's the self-contained breathing apparatus. So your inputs are those 3 factors, outputs are these. And we had a 7-step process to undertake to move through to ensure that it was justified to use the system, and then to look at the levels necessary for identify the bioaerosol, confirm that it does pose a hazard. That there are some that are non-infectious or so low level that it is not a consideration. We select the appropriate wheel, that is whether it's healthcare or a general workplace from the ventilation point of view, and then go through that process of determining on the 1 to 4 scale, the biological risk, the generation level, and the control level applied. And then we have some wheels that we use to then take those inputs to the outputs. These are examples of the biohazard risk. The wording there is from the National Institute of Health, and some examples are provided of diseases that and the levels that are associated. Generally, you are looking to deal with respiratory protection for biological aerosols that are on this list, but there may be some judgment needed for new ones. World Health Organization gave SARS a level 3. That again is something we could argue about because of its the lack of any treatments available early on, but that did allow it to be studied in level 3 labs rather than level 4 ones. So those are some examples there of items. For the generation inputs, we had some qualitative examples of what the levels meant, so that again some judgment could be applied, going from very little generation to high level generation. And some examples for general workplaces, say dealing with some biological hazard that's again not an infectious disease. And then for the control levels, again, we looked at air changes per hour as criteria and some examples of where those levels are found. So going from the lowest to the highest. And we recognize, particularly in healthcare right now, there may be situations where places are so overcrowded that you aren't undertaking procedure in the ideal circumstances. It may be undertaken in a patient room that intubation has to be done, and so you may have lower than levels of air exchange than would be ideal for typical use. Taking these 3 sets of inputs, we then had a system for converting those into the outputs, and we used something called the Koch wheel, where the sector the square around the side, the quarter there is the agent hazard level. Then the chords are the control level, and the sectors around the side are the generation level. And I'll show an example of how this applies in a minute. Just to say, those colors, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 0 to 4, there relate to these hierarchy of protection levels for the equipment. And then with that, as an example, for COVID-19, for instance, an intubation being undertaken in a patient room because there is not enough space elsewhere. We do confirm transmission from COVID-19. We're working in a healthcare facility. It's a level 3 risk. We are looking at level 4 generation. This is the highest level that you tend to have associated with aerosol generating procedures, but the control level is not high. It's in a patient room. We need to go through that set of criteria and identify what the output is. This is done in this way. This is the healthcare wheel. We've got, first of all, the risk group 3. So that's this bottom left quarter there. The generation level is a G4, and that's this loop there. And then the control level is a C2, and that's that section there. So where those areas intersect is the recommended output from this method, and that in this case is a 2, and that corresponds with a loose-fitting powered air purifying respirator. So other guidance might have said N95, but in this case, recognizing that poor level of ventilation, the recommendation is in fact a higher level of respirator than would otherwise be done. And when we compare this with some existing guidance, CDC says filtering facepiece or above. And the California Occupational Health and Safety Act says a powered air purifying respirator or above. So we are in agreement with some of the guidance that's out there, and in fact, we do not conflict with any guidance by using this method. So that's an example there. And as I mentioned, the guidance is available for viewing on a website. One can also mention that in Quebec, following the development of the Canadian standard, a committee met that also created a guidance there for use in Quebec. This is available as an online tool. The algorithm is slightly different, but generally the outputs overlap. But it's a very convenient thing to use. There's a link to that at the end. And again, it's using the same 3 types of input and giving an assigned protection factor, APF, as an output. And that corresponds. In general, the Quebec method will give the same as or slightly more conservative recommendation than the Canadian one. And say there's a list of references here. And with that, I'd say thank you very much, and welcome questions when we have time for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. And it's really wonderful that you've taken the time out to expand on the Canadian standard and also the control banning section, and I really appreciate you doing that. So thanks. So this is a CAN 99. So this is produced by a company called Vitacore, and also provided a link to the chat box to Vitacore. Vitacore are actually donating respirators to NGOs overseas. So if there's an on-the-ground NGO that would like to facilitate, panning out respirators, they can. But I just think it's so important that people understand how important face fit is, and thanks for taking the time out. So thanks again. So and we'll sort of talk a bit more at the end. So the last presenter couldn't make it, Dr. Jen McDonald, who's been an amazing advocate in Canada as part of the National Aerosol Coalition. She's a medical doctor. She runs a busy practice, and she's also a mother. And I believe Marianne was going to facilitate the final piece with sharing Jen McDonald's information.
Yes, and I do want to thank Jen in absentia. She really wanted to be here, but she was having a family issue, as you might imagine, with a busy doctor and a young family. And some issues came up and she could not attend. But I did want to share with you some of the things she would have talked about, because I think they're important for people who don't have access to the kind of fit testing equipment that Stacy was mentioning. So recognizing the time, and I also just want to mention, I think our speakers are happy to stay at least till the next hour to answer questions. So we will have time for questions, and I will very briefly just share some of the things that Jen has done that I just put together kind of on short notice to share some things that she has been active in, because I think they could be of interest. Here's a picture of Jennifer being fit tested, which I grabbed from her Twitter feed. She has a great Twitter feed, and I'll send you a link to it. She is a physician, she's a physiatrist, and she's been extremely active since the start of the pandemic, and we have gotten to know her through the Aerosol Transmission Coalition. And just so you get a sense of her, here's a clip she did from a different webinar. Bear with me, I just wouldn't allow editing. I have to advance to the part where she is speaking, and I won't use all of it because of the time. And there's somebody else but who spoke at this other one. But this is Jennifer, and I'll just play a little bit of this.
It's easy to put on and off. But if I really want to, increase my safety, I could even add a ear saver to the back, and now I'm really tightening it up. So now if I blow out, I really don't feel anything leaking out. So that is.
And so in the interest of time, I won't show that whole thing, but I think the point she was making is that there are many options if you cannot get a good, well-fitting, sort of approved respirator under either a Canadian or a US standard or a European standard. There are some things you can do, such as using a mask brace. And if you go to her Twitter feed, she'll talk about that. And there's links to that whole video, which I will send to you in the chat box. But one thing I found extremely interesting was that she had done a little program of do-it-yourself fit testing. And this is not ideal. I am going to ask our panelists after this what they think of this. But I think we have to bear in mind that many people do not have access to the fairly expensive equipment needed for both quantitative and qualitative fit testing. So there are methods online for do-it-yourself, and they mainly involve a nebulizer, which you can buy at a drugstore. And here's a picture of it, of this thing with a, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but with sort of a nozzle sticking out of it that aerosolizes solutions. And she did this with a nebulizer and a Bitrex solution, which is the kind that 3M uses in their proper equipment, which tastes very bitter. There are other people who have done it with a saccharin solution, which is perhaps better, more available, because you can actually go to the store and buy some saccharin and then mix up some saccharin solution yourself. She did it with a plastic bag, but I have some cautions about a plastic bag I'll get to later. So on her Twitter feed, you can see that what she did was she tested a whole lot of different things on her family, and she did it with surgical masks and a whole lot of other masks, including ear loop masks, which may not fit as well as the headband masks that Stacy demonstrated. And so here are the different masks that some of them you will have just seen. Some of them are elastomeric, which is often a better choice if people can wear them, as well as the surgical masks. And so again, on that feed, you'll see that even the ear loop mask did work quite well. And she also found that using a mask brace, which is a device you can get, and I could probably show you in a little while after this, what a mask brace looks like, to get better fit with a non-approved mask, such as a medical procedure mask or even an ear loop mask that would not normally give you very good fit. And all these ear loop masks did successfully block the bitter taste from the Bitrex. So she got a pretty good fit with that. And she was pointing out that the surgical mask with the big gaps around the cheeks did fail the Bitrex test. And she did want to emphasize that this was an email she sent to us when she found that she couldn't attend. Please emphasize, I'm not advocating for people putting bags on their heads. So we don't really want to necessarily advocate for that do-it-yourself plastic bag, but it's very useful to educate people and convince them that the bad quality masks, and she meant the ones with the gaps, are not very good. And she's been able to convince healthcare workers to switch to respirators based on getting them to inhale Bitrex. And it can be done with just putting the solution up close without the bag. And here is a clip. I'm going to mute the sound. We couldn't get good sound on this, so I'm going to mute the sound. So you can't hear her talking, but I just want to show you, she's showing people how to use that nebulizer without a plastic bag. So she's just using it as a nebulizer and testing it to see if people will inhale the solution. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you anymore, but I did want to share that with you because I think it's very interesting that there may be approaches for people who don't have access to that kind of equipment.